Welcome to JonGetsGames. Today I'll be reviewing Discoveries. In this 2 to 4 player dice game, you will be following the Lewis and Clark expedition as they explore the American Midwest. Along the way you'll be negotiating with American Indians, but mechanically what you'll be doing is rolling a bunch of dice and trying to match them up with different river and mountain cards while building an engine with these Native American cards. So first I will go through how the game plays, and then I'll jump into my review. Here's the starting setup for a game of Discoveries. We have this deck of cards here, and each card is actually double-sided. One side has some exploration with rivers and mountains, and the other side has American Indians, which you can negotiate with. And it's good to note that varying numbers of cards are removed from the deck based on the player count. This is our player board here, and at the beginning of the game, we need to start with a discovery card right here in the slot. So we pick one from this card row. We go ahead and take this one, slide it in there. We're now ready to start the game. We take all 5 of our dice, and we roll them in the middle. Everybody does this at the same time. Each player on their turn has to pick one out of 2 different options for evaluating their turn. The first of these options is to choose one of the 4 die face types on the dice that are face up in front of them, and they get to evaluate as many dice as they want that have that symbol. For instance, right here, you could pick the footstep icon, and you could put them down onto your player board. So when you activate dice, you put them on slots that are on your player board or American Indian cards that you might acquire later on in the game. For instance, right here, you'll see this requires 2 footsteps because you see the 2 little overlapping squares. So you could put both of those there, and you could also take this one and go over here to evaluate this action. Some actions get evaluated immediately on the turn they're placed, and other actions get evaluated later. The ones that get evaluated later have this journal die with the A associated with them. So these right here won't really do anything for us at the moment. You can think of this kind of like planning for our journey. But this one happens immediately. So what you do here is you change 1 or 2 die in your area to the same die face. So for instance, we could just say we want this to become a negotiate die, and then that would finish our turn. At this point, you'll see this little arrow. That means this die is going to leave our board, and then over here, you'll notice that one of these 2 has an arrow, which means the top one is also going to leave our board. When they leave your board, they go onto the central board here, and they go in the side that is associated with the die face that they currently have. So let's talk about the other actions that are available to us. You could put any die on this slot in order to trade out the card that you've picked earlier with any of the cards that are currently up in the general row. And now we have the 2 negotiation slots. They each let you get American Indian cards into your area and essentially get the help of their tribes. This first one takes a single negotiate die to get a friendly American Indian card, and the second one requires 2 negotiate dice to go down in order to get a wary American Indian card. The American Indian cards give you extra options for things you could do on your turn. For instance, some of them let you manipulate the dice, like this one lets you change 1 die into a foot symbol, and then other ones help you traverse the terrain better, and I'll explain how these kind of things work later. You'll see this icon in the top. This is the friendly icon, and this is the wary icon. And finally, they have these TP icons on them, but I'll explain those in a little bit. Whenever you negotiate with the American Indians and get a card, you will also always grab a neutral gray die. You'll roll that and immediately put it in your player area, and you can continue to use that on future turns. And of course, this slot has an arrow, so this would go up to the central board. So now let's talk about all these traveling locations down here. And again, I said you can't actually use those spots until you put the journal dice down. And you can't put the journal die face down until you've filled in the left-hand slot. So in this case, for instance, we've got this foot here. This is already primed, and we got this horseshoe here. So we could take both of these journal dice and activate them and put them down like this. This is going to activate both of these locations. And what that means is we now get to move 2 rivers, and we have a river plus 2 mountains. It's important to note that on cards like this with a plus, you have to go in that order. You can't do mountains before rivers, and you also can't split up the numbers. You can't go like mountain, river, mountain. No, it must be river, mountain, mountain in this instance. And if you look at the exploration card we have in front of us, it has 3 rivers and a mountain going from the bottom to the top. And you always do explore from the bottom to the top. So in this instance, we have 2 rivers from the horseshoe, which gets us these 2 ways. And then we have a river and 2 mountains, which gets us a 3rd river, and then takes care of this mountain here. Now, it is good to know that you can burn excess, so like that extra mountain, you're not going to be able to use in this case. At this point, you take the card, you slide it underneath this little protector here, and you will then pick a new card from the display to put up in your area. And finally, once you've chosen that new card, you'll take all the dice that were associated with that exploration, you're going to roll them, put them in your area, and that will finish your turn. There is one more aspect to exploration that I'd like to talk about, and that is the ability to explore through the cards you have and then through one of the neutral cards that are in the center of the table. For instance, if you had this setup right here with these 3 journals, you could place them down just like that, and then you could spend this 2 rivers in order to go the first 2 rivers up here. You could spend your next river to go here, and then these 2 mountains could get you into these two mountains here, essentially conjoining these two cards. And finally, these three rivers would give you this last river right here. You'd be wasting two, but you would end up exploring both of these cards, which is important because not only do you get both of them and put them underneath your player card, but it also means that after you take a new card in your area and re-roll the dice you used, you get a bonus turn and you can immediately activate these dice again if you wanted. So the other thing you could do on your turn, instead of activating the dice in your area, is you can grab dice and roll them. There are three different ways you could do this. The first way is you could just grab dice of your color. So in this instance, I could grab these three right here and roll them. Also, I could re-roll any of these if I wanted to, like so, and that would complete my turn and it would pass to the next player. But you actually have another option available to you. You can instead grab all the dice on one side or the other of this board and re-roll those, including the dice of your opponents. So for instance, you could grab all of these instead. You only have 2 of your own dice, but now you're rolling 5 dice instead of the 5 total you could potentially have before. And now you have 7 dice in your area. This does end your turn, so before it gets back to you, one of these other players might do a dive recall action where they grab the ones of their color, and that will pull them from your area, including if they were saved up on any of your explore slots, so that's important to know. But by the time it comes back to you, you're going to be incentivized to use these dice of your opponents quickly before they take them back from you, and this allows you to get many more dice. Players will keep taking actions until all the cards in the deck are gone, and then until all of the cards in this central area are also picked up. Only once somebody goes to grab a card that isn't there does the endgame trigger. That person is done with their turn, and everybody else gets one more turn, and then the game is over and you count up your victory points. So you grab all of the explored cards underneath your player board here, and first of all you just add up the numbers in the bottom left-hand corner here, so 9 plus 5 plus 3. But then you have these icons, and if you look at your player board, you'll see, first of all, this is double-sided. This is the 2 to 3 player side, and this is the 4 player side. So pretending we're in a 2 to 3 player game, you'll see that for each set of different symbols, and there are 4 of them in the game, you will get 3, 8, 15, or 24 victory points. So in this case, we have a set of 3, and we have a set of 1. So this card right here is worth 3 points, and this set of 3 cards here is going to be worth 15 points total. And lastly, each player counts up the number of TPs that are showing amongst all the American Indian cards in front of them, so in this case it's 5, and then you also count up the number of TPs that were hidden underneath your scoring stack because some of them appear on these exploration cards. So in this instance, the white player here has 6 TPs. And then you look down here, the person with the most TPs gets 12 points, the person with the second most gets 6 points, and the third most gets 0 in the 2 to 3 player game, and then it's 12, 8, or 4 in the 4 player game. And the person with the most points wins the game. Alright, so let's start the review of discoveries, and we can begin with a few positive points. The first of these relates to how this game handles the dice. It is a dice game, but it does some things differently than most other games. First of all, when you think of a dice game, you kind of assume you're going to roll some dice every single turn, and then you're going to do something with them. But this game kind of flips out on its head. You are only rolling the dice like every 2 to 4 to 5 turns, depending on how the situation pans out and how many dice you're actually rolling. It's really cool how you have this planning vibe to it, where you look at your dice and you're trying to figure out how you are going to deal with the die faces that are in front of you. And there are lots of ways to change the dice as well, and it's not just, oh, re-roll it and hope to get a better action. You have American Indian cards which let you easily flip dice around. You have a player, an action on your player board where one die of any type can change 2 other dice to whatever you want, which in most dice games would be like a really expensive late game ability, and in this game you begin the game with it. So the designers obviously wanted you to be able to heavily manipulate your dice and mitigate the luck in that respect. I also love the way that you use the different colored dice, how you can just grab a bunch of dice from the central board that have other player colors dice in it, and you roll those and try to use those as quickly as you can before they call them back, and it adds an extra layer of tension where when somebody is using your dice, you might call them back on your turn, using up your entire turn instead of doing something else that might be more interesting and actually get you points because you want to deny your dice from your opponent. So it's just, I just love how they've done this. You're not rolling the dice every turn. You're incentivized to grab a bunch of dice when it's out there and stop your opponents from using yours. It's a bunch of really refreshing aspects to a dice game, and I really enjoyed them. Positive number 2 relates to the American Indian cards on a couple different levels. The first is thematic. I really like the way the game portrayed the American Indians on these cards. I feel like it wasn't exploitative or appropriative in any way. In fact, on the front page of the rulebook, there's a paragraph that explains that they look to polling data to figure out what they should call them, and that most American Indians would prefer to be called American Indians. I didn't know that, so I'll refer to them as that in this video as well. But then talking about the mechanics of the American Indian cards, I really enjoy the way you are essentially building a customized engine for yourself. Many of the cards allow you to manipulate the dice in some way or another, or break the rules of the game in some way or another. Most of the cards just give you new ways to explore, which is another way of kind of building an engine in front of you, because the base ways that you explore on your player board, they're okay, but you're not going to be able to do those big double turns or navigate those really big point cards very well with those cards. So you need to be very smart about how you negotiate with American Indians, and I just really enjoy that aspect of the game. It's fun building some building blocks together and make a nice little engine in front of yourself. Positive number 3 relates to the amount of hidden information in the game, specifically relating to the teepees. Now, of course, you cover up all of the explore cards as you explore them, so you don't know how many exact victory points your opponents have, and it can be hard to gauge where you are with relation to your opponents sometimes. But with the teepees, you can gauge somewhat accurately where you are. You just count the number you see, and you count the number that are in front of them. But some of those explore cards have teepees on them, which is a really simple mechanic, but it adds a really nice amount of tension to the game, especially near the end, where you might be able to count up and see that you're 1 or 2 teepees up on an opponent, but you might still negotiate 1 or 2 more times with the American Indians to try to lock that down, because 12 victory points is a pretty real amount in the game. Like, that's a very large swing, and you could definitely win with that, so you need to pay attention to it. And I just like how almost all of them are face up, so you have a pretty good idea. It's not all about memorizing what people have taken, and then finally at the end of the game you reveal them, and it's just a good moment. I like its addition in the game. So now let's go into my neutral points, and for the first of these, I'm once again going to talk about those American Indian cards, but this time I'm specifically talking about the 2 different types of cards and how they can sometimes come out in different amounts. It seems like most of the American Indian cards have the enhanced exploration actions on them. They let you do 2 rivers and a mountain, or 4 mountains, and you get to do stuff in more efficient and different ways, and it is interesting trying to get a couple of those that work well together. But it seems like there are a lot more of those than the more interesting dice manipulation, rule-breaking, or bending kind of American Indian cards. And I found that at lower player counts, you have the possibility of very few of those more interesting style cards coming out, just because a lot of cards are not even in the deck. And then also you could just have a situation where those more interesting cards are explored. They never get flipped over and turned into American Indian cards that you can negotiate with. And this does not hurt the game overall. That's why this is a neutral point. I played a 2-player game once where not a single dice manipulator card came up, and it was just exploration cards. And it was an okay version of the game. We didn't hate it, but it did not show off what the game really does well. So I kind of wish there were a little bit less of the explory cards and a little bit more of the manipulation, do interesting stuff cards. But at the end of the day, it doesn't hurt the game. This is definitely not a negative point. And for neutral point number 2, I want to discuss the role of randomness in this game. So obviously it's a dice game. When you roll a bunch of dice, randomness is going to abound. On those dice, there are 4 different symbols. 2 of them, the journal and the feet, they show up twice on the d6, and then the other 2, the negotiate and the horsehoof, they only show up once. And I have seen situations where the very first roll of the game, if one person gets no negotiates and somebody else gets like maybe 2 or even 3, that other person is definitely starting off on a better foot. Now, when it gets to the person who rolled none of them, they can of course burn a die in order to flip 2 dice over to the negotiate side, and they will be able to get some of those American Indian cards and start building an engine, because that's what you want to do in the early game, is start building up your engine. You don't want to be going for points at that spot. And so it is a possibility where somebody could roll a little better in the early game than another person and maybe get a bit of an advantage. But the flip side is true, where they could roll worse later on and you could roll better. I've seen situations where somebody rolls like 8 dice and all they need is like 1 journal, which happens twice on each die, and none of them show up. And they like do the math, like, that's like a 1 in a huge number chance. I can't believe it. And that will happen in a dice game. Randomness does happen. And my neutral point number 1 relates to randomness with how the American Indian cards come out. Sometimes it's a more interesting set of cards than other times. And you just need to know that. I mean, I think nobody is going to be looking at this dice game and surprised that there are significant random factors that come into play. And I do think that the game does a good job of mitigating them. Like I mentioned before, there's this really strong ability on your player board where you can just turn 2 dice over. And there are lots of ways to access new dice and roll those. And every time you roll dice, you have more shots at getting the things that you need. So I don't think that randomness plays too much of a factor in this game, but I just wanted to muse about it a little bit. So now let's go into my one negative for the game. I've noticed several times now that in the mid to late game, there can be a rich get richer issue. And that has to do with two different things. The first thing is that whenever you finish exploring, you take all the dice that you used, you roll them, and you can have access to them on your next turn. The second piece of this puzzle is that whenever you do a double explorer, where you do the card in front of you and then one that's out in the central board, you get a bonus turn. So you do that, and you explore both those cards, which is great. That's like 2 cards worth of points. You put that underneath there, you're doing good. Then you grab a new card, you put it in front of you, you roll a bunch of dice. Probably, if you're exploring 2 cards, you're probably going to be re-rolling at least 5 dice, maybe even 7 I've seen. And then you get a bonus turn. So you just rolled like 5 or 7 dice. You have a ton of dice in front of you, and you can immediately put them down onto your different spots, and you might have negotiated with the American Indians to the point where you could do a lot with one specific die face, which you should probably be doing. And if you rolled well, especially if you just needed a bunch of feet, then you just plunk all those down, and by the time it comes back around to you, you can explore again. Now, of course, you need to roll well in order to do that, but I've definitely seen that happen where somebody kind of gets on a roll, they do a double explore, they get their bonus move, it comes back to them, they explore again, maybe it comes back and they're able to get another double explore going on in a turn or two, and the other people are kind of spinning their wheels a little bit. They're watching this one person just going through explore after explore. They kind of pick up some momentum and they keep going, specifically because of that double grab, which is a bit of a random chance. Like sometimes all the cards on the card row are big, beefy cards that are very hard to double into, but then sometimes you reveal the cards that's just 1 mountain or 3 rivers. And in the mid to late game, nailing 3 rivers is very easy to do with many different options in front of you. So I am a little concerned about that. I almost wish there was not the bonus extra turn. Like, I like the idea of exploring through your card and exploring out into the main area, and I feel like that is almost good enough to cause people to do it, especially because you get that massive reroll and you get to go in with a bunch more stuff the next time it comes back around to you. I'm not going to house rule it at this point. I don't think it's that big of a deal, but if I continue to see it going forward, I might actually end up house ruling it. At this point, I'm not exactly sure. Maybe it is just that person's playing the game way better than the other people, but once you start to see this over and over again, where the scores for like the second and third place people are really close, and then the first place person blows them out of the water, and that happens over and over again, that the person who wins, they win by a huge margin, and then everybody else is kind of clustered, it has me kind of scratching my head. Alright, so now let's discuss the replayability of discoveries. And I've thought about this one quite a bit. And I think at the end of the day, it's a little bit above average in the replayability category. Now, that is because every card in the game has American Indians on one side and an exploration card on the other side. And the exploration cards, well, they're all rivers and mountains, mountains and rivers. There's not that much variety there, but on the back side, you have the American Indian cards that can be kind of engine buildy, but the majority of them are not. They're just different ways to get across mountains and rivers and mountains. And I think that there is a little bit of replayability added in with the way that the cards come out. Like from one game to the next, you might see a lot of dice manipulators. In one game, you might see very few in the next one. So how you specifically play it, one game you might end up going for a bunch of TPs because that's just the way it's made sense for you. And in other games, you might just ignore those entirely and you're just going for big double moves. So I think that the fact that it's just rivers and mountains brings it down a little bit, and I think the fact that you have a reasonable variety of the American Indian style actions kind of brings it back up again. It leaves it pretty much at average. I'm feeling like it's slightly above average, but some people could definitely argue with me on that one. So now let's take a look at the different player counts that Discoveries supports. It is a 2 to 4 player game, and I've played all of those different sets, and I think that 3-player is right on the money, the best way to play this game. The 2-player experience is decent, but as I mentioned before, you have a much higher likelihood of running into a less interesting set of American Indian cards because so much of the deck is just removed from the game, and you can just randomly remove a lot of the good ones and find yourself with a less interesting experience because all you're doing is finding different ways to go across rivers and mountains. And then on the 4-player side, it does work pretty well actually, and I would have no problem playing it 4 players really at any point, but there can be a little bit of downtime, especially once things are getting near the late game. There can be some thinking because you need to think a couple turns in advance, like I'm going to do this on this turn, next turn I'm going to do that, the turn after that I'm going to do this and cash out. And then you need to think, well, will the cards even be out there that I need to use? Analysis paralysis has not been a big deal, but I don't think that having that fourth person adds a lot to the gameplay because well, also in the two-player game, there's only one other person to kind of borrow dice from, and in a three-player game, there's two different people. So yeah, I think 3 is best, specifically due to downtime. It keeps the game going at a little bit better of a pace. 4 is fine, and there is kind of the added benefit. That is a lot of extra dice to potentially grab and roll and make use of in your area. In conclusion, I feel that Discoveries is a bit of a breath of fresh air into the dice game genre. I like dice games in general, but I really like the way that Discoveries has tipped a couple dice game tropes on their head. You are not rolling your dice every single turn. You are rolling them and then strategizing out several turns in advance, trying to figure out what you're going to do. And then when you go to re-roll your dice, well, you can grab a bunch of your opponent's dice, roll them, and try to use them before your opponent grabs them, and that adds a really nice amount of tension. I also really like the American Indian cards. Obviously, I've mentioned it several times, but that's far from a new thing to this game. I think many dice games allow you to get upgradable powers so that you manipulate dice. That's really not new. And when it comes to the actual goal of the game, which is exploration, trying to make your way through these cards, I like the puzzle of figuring out how you're going to get through your card right here and then potentially also going through one of the ones on the main board to try and get that big double turn. But the flip side is, they're just river and mountain icons. Like, I don't really feel like I'm doing that much exploring. I don't know, I wish there was maybe a third kind of icon, but that might make things too complicated. I'm not exactly sure about that. I will say that I've really enjoyed playing this game, but several people I've played with have been somewhat lukewarm to it. I don't think I've played it with anybody who's actively disliked it, but many people I've played with, we were packing up the game, and I'm like, well, what'd you think? And they say, it was okay. It's not really that exciting. I might play it again. And I'm like, oh wow, I'm surprised. I really liked it. I want to play this game pretty much as often as I can. So I think you should definitely keep that in mind, that while I'm quite excited about it and I really have enjoyed it, and I don't know, hopefully they'll maybe do an expansion in the future. I'm not a big fan of expansions, but I feel like this one would be one I would definitely go out and grab. It definitely is possible that this game could be a bit of a letdown for you because for some people, it just doesn't get them very excited. If you'd like to see more in-depth board game reviews like this one, as well as full game playthroughs and vlogs, please subscribe to my channel. Also, you can directly support the channel at patreon.com/JonGetsGames. Thanks for watching.